works be. All right, so I'm Frank Huntington. I live across town in Thorndike Gardens. I thought I was going to be a history professor. I got a PhD at Brown University. The job market turned out to be terrible, and so I panicked and did the only sensible thing. I went to law school. So I got a law degree from Harvard. At my 10-year college reunion, I had been in graduate school for 10 years. And, some people thought that was pretty cool, and some people thought I was insane. But in any event, so I was a lawyer for a profession and retired a few years ago. My last job was at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, which has a Boston office. But the views expressed here today do not reflect those of the Securities and Exchange Commission or the incoming administration. I'm pretty sure of that. Okay, well, looks like we might as well start. Rob, can you get the lights when you have a chance? All right, so I'm going to turn the lights off so you'll be able to see the slides a bit better. I hope that's okay. Ooh, that's bright. Hold on here. Thank you, Rob. Oh, perfect. This is ambiance, right? Okay. Well, so what I thought I'd do, in the spring, I taught a course on threats to democracy in the 20th century, and a lot of people said they enjoyed the talks and appreciated them, but found they were really depressing. And so the number of people asked me to do something a little lighter this time around. So I'm going to try to talk about American society and culture at different points in time over the last 200 years. I can't cover everything, but I'll try to give you a snapshot for these different time periods of basically how people lived, what kind of work they did, what kind of religion they believed in, what they were reading, what popular entertainment there was, what new consumer products were showing up. The modern world that we take for granted evolved over time during the 19th and 20th century. So I'm optimistic that there will be the occasional joke. We'll see. Not something you could do about threats to democracy. All right, so there we are. And again, this is one of the problems with the with this room instead of the chapel. The screen's kind of back there, and I don't know how well you can see it in the back of the room, and I'm sorry for that. But it's the best we can do. So that's a map of America right after the Revolution. You've got the original colonies, and then the treaty with Great Britain added all that green stuff out to the Mississippi River. Doubled the size of the country just through the treaty. There weren't many white settlers out there at the time, but it added a great deal to the potential for the country. The big change in terms of the size of, my first section here is about people on the move. And in the early 19th century and up to the Civil War, lots of people were going in lots of different directions. It was a very exciting and energetic place to be. And one big change came in 1803 when President Thomas Jefferson got himself a bargain in France. At the time of the Revolution, Spain controlled Louisiana, and so if you had goods on the Mississippi River you wanted to send down through the Gulf, you had to go through New Orleans. And in 1802, Spain closed New Orleans to American shipping. Now, at the time, Napoleon was very successful in Europe, and he was in control of Spain. He put one of his brothers on the throne there. So Thomas Jefferson decides he sends James Monroe to France to make a deal with Napoleon to pay him some money so that we could continue to ship goods through New Orleans. But Napoleon had decided he'd had enough of colonies. And so Napoleon was prepared to sell the whole darn thing. And what was then known as Louisiana, it's that big green chunk there. And so Jefferson had sent Monroe to Paris to offer $10 million for just the trading rights. Napoleon sold him the whole thing for $11.5 million, which in today's dollars is $320 million. which is not peanuts, but considering what they got, it's an unbelievable bargain. So it doubled the size of the country overnight. Once you have it, Jefferson figured, well, I guess I ought to find out what it was I've just bought. So he sent explorers out to take a look. And I don't know how well you're going to be able to see that on the slides, but he commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to follow the Missouri River, which is the red line, up toward Canada and then all the way west to the Pacific. They got through the Rockies with help from Indian guides. They followed the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean, and just the fact that they had gotten to the Pacific gave America a sort of questionable claim to what was then called Oregon Territory. That purple stuff in the back there, in the upper west. General Zebulon Pike did some exploring of his own. He's the green line. He went all the way up the Mississippi into Minnesota to figure out where it came from. And then he went across the plains to the Rockies. And as people probably know, he's got a mountain named for him out there, which he never managed to climb, but at least he saw it. Pike comes back and reports that that whole area in the center, the Great Plains, is so dry and there's just thick prairie grass everywhere that it really can't be farmed. So he reported back that the Great Plains were going to be useless for white settlements, and we might as well just leave the land to the Indians. And in fact, for a number of years, one American general coined the expression "the Great American Desert" to describe the Great Plains. So the idea that the Great Plains didn't have their own economic value lasted for quite a while. The federal government made it really easy to move. Over and over, the government sold off land, made the minimum amount you could buy smaller and smaller so that it was easier for people, kept dropping the price per acre. And particularly when Andrew Jackson was president, that's the huge spike. The government sold 160 million acres in the space of about 50 years. It's estimated that more people acquired their own land to farm than anywhere else ever in human history. I mean, it was an amazing opportunity if you could do it. Amazing opportunity for white settlers, but there were people living there. And this map shows the stages of how the American Indian tribes were dispossessed. You start with, of course, the colonies, the kind of dark green. But by 1830, American Indian tribes had been pushed out of this whole eastern part of the United States. There were very few tribes left. And then, to make it even easier, in 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which was one of Andrew Jackson's favorite objectives. It gave the federal government the power to push every single Indian tribe west of the Mississippi. They created what were known as Indian territories in what is now Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Kansas. And at gunpoint, they cleared out, particularly the very well-advanced settled tribes in the South. The five tribes, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Seminoles, all got driven out because white settlers wanted their land. The most notorious episode of that has become known as the Trail of Tears. The government sent the Cherokees west in October of 1838 without enough supplies. And over the course of that winter, there were 16,000 Cherokees who started, and 4,000 of them died on the trip. White settlers were also moving into Texas, which was at that time technically belonged to Mexico. In 1821, a fellow named Michael Austin got a land grant for Mexico, and within just a few years, there were 35,000 white settlers in Texas. They brought their slaves with them, and when the government of Mexico decided to stamp out slavery, the white settlers in Texas declared their independence from Mexico. The Mexican army attacked, besieged, and then slaughtered everybody in the Alamo there. There were about 200 Texans defending the Alamo. Even when they surrendered, they were all executed by the Mexicans. But a couple of months later, that gentleman, Sam Houston, led a Texas army that defeated the Mexicans, drove them back. And so in 1836, the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star Republic, was formed. That was, there's Sam. He was the first president of Texas. Texans think big. Traditionally, the boundary of Texas compared to the rest of Mexico was the Nueces River. So the dark green is what Texas originally was, but the Republic of Texas claimed everything in green on that map, all the way down to the Rio Grande. And that's going to turn out to be the cause of war a few years later. So now you have, and Texas was annexed by a treaty, so now we have America stretching through the Great Plains and down through Texas. And then you got California. In 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento. And the gold rush. The white population of California went from 10,000 people to 100,000 in 1 year. Hence the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, that's who they're named for. San Francisco itself went from 1,000 people to 35,000 people in 2 years. And within 10 years, they were mining $500 million of gold every year in California. Another group on the march in this period before the Civil War, the Mormons. In 1830, Joseph Smith, that's him there on the left, he was only 24. He lived in upstate New York, and he had a revelation that an angel came to him and showed him where to find the buried golden tablets that contained the Book of Mormon. He started getting followers. The group was persecuted from the very beginning by the traditional Protestants in upstate New York who didn't get what Smith was talking about. They particularly objected to the practice of bigamy, which Smith justified as all those patriarchs in the Old Testament, right? Abraham, they all had lots of wives. Smith thought it was biblically sanctioned by the Bible, which might have made sense on one level, but did not persuade the people in upstate New York. Smith and the Mormons were driven out of upstate New York. They worked their way. They were driven into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. In 1844, a mob in Illinois murdered Smith and his brother. And the new leader was Brigham Young. That's him on the right. So Young figures, we've got to go someplace where they'll never find us. And he tried. He led the Mormons all the way to Great Salt Lake. I don't know if any of you have been out there, but it's really remote out there. He really thought they'd be left alone. Within just a couple of years, there were 11,000 Mormons living in what he called Deseret. And very small settlements on the edge of a very salty lake. But some white settlers wanted to just keep going. And so you have people starting to think about settling the Pacific coast. There were regular trails set up to head from Missouri, which was kind of the jumping off point. You had the main trail split in Idaho. You had the Oregon Trail, which is in red on the map there. A California trail that went down into Northern California through the Sierra Nevadas. Another one that went down into what is now New Mexico. And there's some pictures of the Oregon Trail. Those people were brave, right? Can you imagine getting in a wagon with all your belongings and heading through that landscape, hoping that you were going to end up someplace where you could actually live? And I don't know if you've been in the central part of Colorado, but you imagine you're riding your wagon across Colorado and you come over one hill and there are the Rocky Mountains. We're going to get through that? It's really, I don't know. I don't know how those people did it. And they didn't all make it. Along the Oregon Trail, there are tombstones for people who died on the trip, and that's someone named S.M. Marshall from Kentucky who died on the trip. By 1850, there were 13,000 whites living in Oregon. more people on the move. This is, as I said, it was a busy time. In the 1840s, another wave of immigration from Europe. Ireland is suffering through the potato famine that began in the 1840s. In Germany, there were bad harvests followed by a revolution in 1848 that was crushed. And so you had a lot of Irish leaving because they didn't have enough to eat, and Germans leaving because they wanted someplace else to farm where they would be left alone. And over the space of 10 years, 3 million new Americans showed up. About half Irish, half German. They were almost all Catholic. And the prejudice against the Catholics at that time was intense. Protestantism still, many Protestants considered, the Roman Catholic Church to be an agent of Satan. And most of the whites living in America at the time were Protestants, Anglo-Saxon background, English, Scottish, and they looked at the immigrants as drunken and dangerous people. That's cartoon on the left there. That's an Irishman in a barrel of whiskey and a German in a barrel of beer. The stereotyped Irishman at a pub there on the right. And the prejudice against particularly the Irish who tried to settle in eastern cities and get jobs. You can see I hope you can read them, the "No Irish Need Apply" signs in those ads for domestic servants. I guess the point is that America has a very, very long history of hatred and prejudice toward recent immigrants, something that obviously we have not outgrown. Okay, how'd people travel doing all of this? The roads were terrible, and it was much easier to move things by water. So there was an incentive in the early 19th century to build canals. And the very first noteworthy canal was in Middlesex County, the Middlesex Canal. I don't know how many of you know that. It ran right along where the Lowell train runs today. It started at the Merrimack River in Chelmsford, worked its way down through Billerica, Wilmington, Woburn, Winchester, the Mystic Lakes in Medford, and ended up in Charlestown. 27 miles. The most famous canal, of course, was the Erie Canal in New York. The state of New York built it. Took them about 7 years. It runs 360 miles from Albany to Lake Erie. And it was an amazing feat of engineering, and the impact on commerce is remarkable. The cost to ship, if you're going to ship a ton of grain from Buffalo, way out there on the left, down to New York City, before the canal it cost $100 to do that. After the canal it cost $5 to do that. New York, the canal helped make New York the leading port on the Atlantic coast. So many goods could now come up from the Great Lakes, down the canal, and then down the Hudson, that shipping really concentrated and exports concentrated from New York City. It got easier to move around on the water thanks to Robert Fulton. In 1807, he launched the Claremont. There it is, pretty impressive looking creature, on the Hudson River. And, remember, rivers are hard because if you go upstream, that's a lot of paddling, but not with the steamboat. His ship could go up to Albany in 32 hours, which seems really slow, but compared to pulling a barge, it was remarkably fast. Once you had steamboats, entrepreneurs started looking for the future. Just 2 years after the Claremont got launched, Cornelius Vanderbilt, you might have heard that name, he opened ferry service between Staten Island and Manhattan using steamboats. And it was like first commercial ferry service, and it was the start of the Vanderbilt transportation empire. Started small. Now, moving around the country got much easier once the railroad shows up. The very first railroad in America was in Quincy, Massachusetts, 3 miles running from a quarry to the Neponset River. That's the trail of it on the photo on the upper left. The first passenger railroad in the country was the Baltimore and Ohio. which is the one on the upper right there, in 1828, Congress and the states handed over land by the, I can't think what noun to use. They just turned over a ton of public land to help the railroads grow. In the 1850s, Congress by itself handed over 20 million acres so that the railroads would be able to do their thing. By 1860, that's what the railroad network looked like. It basically connects New England and the Midwest with a little bit of activity in the South, but not very much. Again, this is a big country, but the change in travel times. If you were going to go from Concord, New Hampshire to Boston, originally it took 4 days to go from Concord, New Hampshire to Boston using the Merrimack River and the Middlesex Canal. With the railroad, it took 4 hours. A trip from Chicago to New York, before the railroad, it took 3 weeks. After the railroad, it took 3 days. So we were conquering space. We were also learning how to send messages across space. Samuel Morse, there he is. He was born in Charlestown. He was the son of a preacher. He actually had quite a career as a portrait painter. That's his portrait of President James Monroe. But in his spare time, he was fascinated with electromagnetism, and he came up with the telegraph. And within a few years, as they built railroads, they put up poles and carried telegraph wires. The railroads desperately needed telegraphs because, you got these trains. Most of the early lines only had one track. Trains are going in both directions. They have to communicate to make sure that bad things don't happen. The telegraph was a huge benefit for that. And in 1856, some enterprising people formed Western Union, so you could send messages. There's an early telegraph slip right there. If it absolutely positively had to get there overnight, the Wells Fargo company developed the stagecoach traffic. They had stagecoaches that ran, it took 23 days by stagecoach to go from St. Louis to San Francisco, which was considered really fast. But for packages, they developed the Pony Express. They could deliver a package in 8 days from St. Louis to Sacramento. That's one of their recruiting posters for the Pony Express. I don't know how well you can read it, so I will help you. They are looking for young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, expert riders, and this is the best part, willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. Heart. Okay. So where were people living? What were they doing for work in the decades before the Civil War? Most people are still farmers. 2/3 of all families in the country in 1850 were still living on farms. So it's mostly an agricultural country. This map sort of sketches out for you the whole eastern half of the country is pretty good for farming. The Great Plains at the time wasn't considered good for farming. It was just grasslands. The desert, the real desert out there where Nevada is. And then there was farming along the California coast. Farmers in the north started concentrating on dairy farming and vegetables because, if you lived in Western Massachusetts, your best chance of raising something that you could make money on was to raise milk and vegetables to sell to places like Boston, where there were a lot of people who didn't have room for a cow or a garden. Out in the Midwest, people were growing wheat and corn and potatoes. And as I mentioned, initially they didn't think anyone could farm the Great Plains, but technology has a way of solving some problems. And in the 1830s, those two gentlemen came to the rescue, if you can call it that. On the upper left there, that's John Deere. John Deere was a blacksmith in Rutland, Vermont. He went bankrupt and moved to Illinois, and went out in Illinois, he developed a steel plow. And the steel plow was able to cut through the prairie grass. And if once you could cut through the grass and turn the soil, you could start farming out there. The fellow below him is Cyrus McCormick, who's from Virginia, and he invented that mechanical reaper with the help of a slave named Joe Anderson. To get that machine harvested 8 times as fast as a regular person could. Because of those two developments, agriculture, the bluer it is, the less farmed, the yellow and red, the more farmed, the more actively farmed areas start moving further and further into the Great Plains through places like Iowa and Missouri. Now, the South, of course, has mostly lots of farmers on small farms, but the South was different. It also had plantations. And in the colonial era, the plantations grew tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, rice in South Carolina, but not cotton. At the time of the colony, at the very beginning of the country, they only had one type of cotton plant that they could grow, and it liked sandy soil by the beach. So it was really limited to the coast. That changed thanks to another inventor, Eli Whitney. Whitney grew up in Westborough, Massachusetts. He went to Yale College, and then he put his mind to solving technical problems for farming, and he invented a machine which was technically known as a cotton engine, but they shortened the second word to gin. So that's a cotton gin. And it's separated the seeds from the fiber. It could do that process 25 times more efficiently than a human being could. And because of that, they could start growing a different kind of cotton that has lots of seeds, but also loves hot weather, hot, dry weather. And so the development of the cotton gin opened up the South to cotton farming. By 1820, cotton farming had spread through mostly upstate South Carolina, a bit of Georgia. By 1860, the whole South is growing cotton, particularly those areas in the red. But by that point, by just before the Civil War, way out in Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, lots of cotton. Cotton output. By 1860, America was selling 6 million bales of cotton. It was by far the most valuable export we had. So, but you might ask yourself, okay, you can't eat cotton. Why did anybody care? Why was it valuable? And the answer to that is the Industrial Revolution, which began in England in the late 18th century. And what it was the use of machinery to spin cotton into the yarn and then weave it into cloth. And cotton clothing was a godsend. Have you ever been to those historical reenactments, particularly like colonial era reenactments, when even in the summer they're wearing flannel? Because all the clothing they had before cotton was wool and flannel or clothing, linen made from flax, heavy stuff. Cotton was revolutionary. It was lighter and you could clean it easier. And so just as we were learning how to grow lots of cotton, clever people with machines were learning how to make lots of cotton cloth. The British did their best to keep the technology hidden in England, but they didn't succeed. And you could say that the Industrial Revolution came to America in the head of that guy there, Samuel Slater. He memorized the design of the new spinning machines, brought them to America, set up the first power mill in the colonies in 1790 in Pawtucket. There it is. It's a museum. You can visit it. The machinery is quite fascinating. He had 9 workers, and they were all boys under the age of 12. Pretty soon, the scale expands. Francis Cabot Lowell. How's that for a Boston name? Francis Cabot Lowell opened the Boston Manufacturing Company, 1814, in Waltham, and built the first integrated cotton factory. It did the spinning, it did the weaving, and it did the finishing of the cloth. Powered by water, but the Charles River, was somewhat helpful, but the Charles is not that strong a river. what New England did have was some better rivers, particularly the Merrimack. And so the Lowell Company in 1823 opened the first industrial town in the country. It was then known as East Chelmsford, but they, of course, renamed it for themselves, so it became the city of Lowell. And, many of the buildings are still there. It became the center, the center of the textile industry in New England. Most of the workers were young women from New England farms. And the idea was they could get away from home, they could make some pocket money for themselves, they'd be independent, save a bit, and then after a few years, they hoped to find someone to marry and leave the mill. It was a kind of a way station in the growth of some of these New England farm girls. They lived in dormitories with chaperones. They all went to church. You can tour some of these. I've done it. It's really fascinating. They had their own literary magazine. There it is, the Lowell Offering. It was the first magazine in America edited by women. New England had enough other rivers that there were textile towns all over the area. Lawrence, Chicopee, Holyoke, Woonsocket in Rhode Island. By 1850, the textile industry employed 100,000 workers, most of them women. But people were applying technology to improve the way you made a number of other things. Rifles and pistols with interchangeable parts. Some clever tinkerers in New England developed small machines to make standardized parts that you could assemble into a gun or a rifle, a musket, and all the parts would fit together. They were identical. Samuel Colt, that's the fellow on the slide, Colt's factory in Hartford was a pioneer of the assembly line for making things. There's his patent for one of his Colt revolvers. Villages all over Connecticut were making mechanical clocks. I don't know if any of you have one of these at home. I inherited a couple, but I'm afraid I no longer have them. But towns all over Connecticut. And the one on the lower left was made by the Waterbury Clock Company, which is the ancestor of Timex. It's still there. New England was filled with people in small shops making things with their hands and with small machines. Half of the nation's total of boots and shoes was made here in Massachusetts. The center of the shoe industry was Lynn. Lots and lots of workers working on their own in little, what were called 10-footers, like that little house. You can still find a few in Lynn to visit. In 1850, Lynn by itself turned out 4.5 million shoes. But there are other shoe places like Natick and Brockton were known for their shoes. All right. What kind of houses do people live in? I found some great. If you were wealthy, you had some really nice choices. Okay, federal style. We've all seen those driving around New England. The one on the upper left is in Salem, Newburyport. The one on the lower right is a Beacon Hill, built kind of a row house, but a federal style row house in Beacon Hill. So you have the federal style. You've all seen these driving around, I bet. Greek Revival. The one on the left is in Newport. This is just fascinating. But the best, if I had to pick a style, Gothic Revival. Have you seen those? So the one on the left is in Newport. The one on the right is in Vermont, Stratford, Vermont. But that jewel at the bottom is in Kennebunkport. Has anybody driven through there and seen it? Oh, is that gorgeous? I can't get over that. Now, of course, if you didn't, most people were living in farmhouses. And there's some representative samples of what farmhouses looked like. The one in the upper left is in Ipswich. If you go on the internet, you can find some lovely photos of what some of the ones that have survived. There was also a new, more practical way to build houses. It was known as balloon framing, where you could using no stone, no cement, nothing but wood, framing and then filling in the walls and putting on a roof. You have lots of those. They are less likely to have survived, but you can see Some like that one in the middle there. You can see places like that in some of New England towns. So that gives you at least a little idea of how people lived. Next, I want to talk about, unfortunately, one of the centerpieces of American society before the Civil War, slavery. I mean, we got to talk about slavery, and that means we have to talk a little bit about language. And so, we're prisoners of our language, right? This is white. Yes? This is not white. This is pink, beige, spotty. You know, I've got spots. I've got all kinds of things. But that is not white. You folks, realistically, you're not white. Black people aren't black. You know, black is a dark room with no lights on. But we are somehow the tyranny of language, black and white, which have all these connotations in the sense of being opposites. And of course, one is good and one is evil in some usages. It's a problem. So I'm going to be using the words white and black because you kind of can't help it. But let's all remember that it's cultural. It's a conception that we're taught. It's not an actual feature of human beings. I mean, the pink part is, yeah, the beige part is, but not the white part. Anyway, so thank you for indulging me on that. In 1860, there were about 17% of Americans were black slaves. There were about 4 million of them. And in 1860, as I mentioned earlier, slaves were responsible for growing all the cash crops in the South. You've got tobacco. The purple is tobacco, Virginia and Kentucky. There's a little bit of rice. That's the green in South Carolina and Georgia. And a little bit of sugar down in Louisiana. That's the brownish. But most of it is, of course, the belt of cotton. Slavery was the foundation of Southern society. It was a way of life. That map shows the percentage of the population who were enslaved. Over 50% of the people in Virginia and the lower South, that's the dark red, over 50% in those regions were slaves. Most Southerners were independent farmers who didn't have any slaves. I found that on the internet. That's the class structure of the South. 75% of the white men who had farms didn't have slaves. Less than 7% of the white men had more than 10 slaves. But that 7%, and particularly the 1% that had a larger number, life was pretty good for them, right? These houses are all still down there. They lived on plantations surrounded by a workforce that didn't have a choice. And, I mean, this is people owning other people. Oh, come on. Okay. Those people are property. Those people are property. Those people are property. Those people picking cotton are property. Owners could break up families anytime they wanted. The law in the South did not recognize slave marriages. So here you've got an engraving of a slave auction in the upper left, and then some ads. Newspapers would be filled with this sort of ad, letting you know that there were slaves available to buy. And you might notice, I don't know how well you can read it, but the language, the slaves are described as, on the lower left there, bucks and wenches, and pickaninnies, which was the name for a small child. So one woman there is being sold with her 6-month-old pickaninny, and you can be pretty sure that the father of that child is either being left behind or has already been sold someplace else. So they were splitting up families whenever business necessitated it. For all the talk about slave owners as, kind of parentally looking out for their slaves, it was a business. I like the one on the right. They're all fully guaranteed except for some of the defects. I don't know how well you can read it, but there's one fellow who has a burn on his back and his right side. I hate to think how he got that. Slave owners could discipline slaves pretty much any way they wanted. They nailed people to trees by the ear, just as a punishment. That one example. The gentleman on that slide is named Peter. He escaped to the Union Army in Louisiana in 1863. He and two companions escaped from their plantation and traveled for 10 days, and they smeared themselves with onions to put off so that the bloodhounds chasing them wouldn't get their scent. They eventually made it to the Union Army. They were examined by Army doctors who took that photo. Those are scars, right? It's where he'd been whipped. Theoretically, an owner could cross the line and do something that was too cruel even by Southern standards, but it virtually never happened, partly because the slaves weren't allowed to testify in court. So who's going to talk? Opposition to slavery developed in the 1830s and 1840s and into the 1850s, and Southern slave owners decided to stop being defensive and start talking about just how great slavery really was. So here are a couple of quotes for you. That fellow on the left is a senator from South Carolina named James Hammond. He said in 1858, "In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class which leads to progress, civilization, and refinement." George Fitzhugh, he was from Virginia, he put it a little more simply: slavery is the natural and normal condition of society. 1858 or so, right before the Civil War. And this was clever. Hammond and Fitzhugh developed the argument that slavery in the South was more humane than factory work in the North. I mean, Hammond, your whole class of manual laborers are essentially slaves. The difference between us, Hammond said, is that our slaves are hired for life and are well compensated. Yours are hired by the day, not cared for, and scantily compensated. Fitzhugh put it this way: capital exercises a more perfect compulsion over free laborers than human masters over slaves. For free laborers, the factory workers in New England must at all times work or starve, but slaves are supported whether they work or not. I mean, there's a twisted logic to that because, a 50 or 60-year-old slave who couldn't work in the fields anymore wasn't just turned out on the street the way a 50-year-old who couldn't work in a textile mill any longer could. There was no safety net for that person in the factories in New England. There was sort of a system designed to protect elderly slaves. Is that enough of a offset for all the other terrible stuff? Not to me, but they had a clever argument, and their criticism of capitalism and wage labor in the North, Karl Marx would have been kind of pleased with that. I bet they never thought of that. Okay, let's move. Changing subjects, I want to talk a bit about religion and reform, because in the decades before the Civil War, there were a lot of people who took religion very seriously and took trying to reform society very seriously. One of the big changes in religion after the Revolution, at the time of the Revolution, many states had an official tax-supported church. In New England, it was the Congregationalists. And there are, beautiful church buildings, right? I can tell you which town each of those is from. But no matter what religion you were, you had to pay taxes to pay for the congregational minister. It was tax-supported religion. And the First Amendment says the U.S. government can't do that, but doesn't prevent the states from doing it. And it took several decades in the 19th century before all the states gave up on having an official state religion. And Massachusetts was the last one to do it in 1833. They finally pulled the plug on the Congregationalists. Another thing happening in New England in the same decades is a split within the Congregationalists, with the Unitarians moving off on their own. One of the leading Unitarians was William Ellery Channing. That's him. He preached at the Federal Street Church, which used to be in downtown Boston. The Unitarians rejected the notion of predestination. They stressed that we all really have free will. They also, downplayed the Jesus Christ as divine and emphasized him as a moral reformer and an example for how to live, but not as a part of the divinity. They were preaching a kind of more rational, stoic, serene kind of religion. And of course, the Unitarians are still with us today. In other parts of America, though, people were preaching a down-to-earth, really emotional kind of religion, because you start having revivals in the early 1800s. This is an engraving of the Cane Ridge Revival that took place in 1801 in Kentucky. 20,000 people showed up to this tiny town in Kentucky for a revival. There were only 200,000 people in Kentucky at the time. 20,000 people. And the emphasis of revival religion on the frontier was repentance for your sins and an emotional acceptance of Jesus as your Savior. Some of the revivalists who traveled the country became quite famous, became celebrities. You know, the celebrity preachers is not something that only the 1980s invented with Jerry Falwell. It goes back quite a ways. The fellow in the upper right there is Charles Grandison Finney, who was from upstate New York and became the president of Oberlin College, which, by the way, was the first college to admit men and women on an equal basis. The fellow below is Lyman Beecher, father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who became the president of the Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. And they traveled the country, and there were networks, and these are mostly ministers not from the mainstream Episcopal or Presbyterian churches. These are mostly Baptists and Methodists traveling the back country, people who did not go to seminaries necessarily, but were good at getting a crowd worked up and communicating their faith. In the decades before the Civil War, a lot of people were looking at America, starting to see changes that made them nervous, like, boy, these people are really obsessed with money. That's not a recent insight. It goes quite a ways back. And a number of people tried various ways to improve American society. One of them was the idea of tax-supported public schools. Like, everybody should be educated. Massachusetts was the pioneer in public education. Boston had the first public elementary school. That's it there. It was on the upper left, 1818. They had the first public high school, Boston English. That's the yellow building on the upper right. I can't find a photo of it because the building's gone, but Worcester had the first public high school for girls, opened in 1824. In 1827, Massachusetts passed a law that every town with more than 500 people had to have a public high school. And the countryside in New England is littered with those little schoolhouses. There's the one on the far right there is in Wakefield. I should go track it down. In 1837, Massachusetts put Horace Mann in charge of the school system, and he developed what he called normal schools, which were training for women to be school teachers. The very first one is that building on the slide. It was opened in Lexington in 1839. And so the idea of having public schools and having special training for teachers spread across the North and the Midwest. By 1840, the literacy rate in the North was 90% for whites, which is pretty darn good. The South lagged behind a great deal. They were much less interested in spending tax dollars on education. The plantation families in the South relied on tutors, private tutors, to train their children. Another one of the reforms of the decades before the Civil War was temperance. That's an engraving by Currier of Currier and Ives called The Drunkard's Progress. You obviously can't read what it says, but it shows him starting out young and innocent and eventually staggering off the thing on the right side of it. Could we? All right. If we could not do that, that would be great. Well, what is that from anyway? Oh, well. So some of you couldn't hear it, but there was an ominous sort of soundtrack going on to the left here. Okay, the temperance, the idea that alcohol destroys families, was a subject of a lot of campaigns. The state of Maine outlawed alcohol in 1851. Most of New England followed in the next 10 years. New York State did as well. The prohibition laws died during the Civil War when everyone sort of recognized that the soldiers need booze to keep going. So the prohibition wasn't enforced any longer. Now, the most prominent reform before the Civil War, of course, was abolitionism. And I'll just talk about a few of the abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison, here he lived in Boston. He began publishing his newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831. Abolitionism was not popular in the North. Lots and lots of people didn't want the subject to be discussed, didn't want to stir up trouble. Remember, a lot of people were making a lot of money in the textile industry in the North using cotton from the South. They had no particular interest in interfering with the production of cotton. In fact, a mob in Boston threatened to hang Garrison in 1835. Later on, 50 years later, they erected a statue to him on Comm Ave in Back Bay. You can still see it. The most famous black abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. He escaped from slavery in 1838. He wrote his autobiography in 1845. It's still in paperback. It's a marvelous read. His insight into slave owners, slave society, and the North, it's fascinating. Really, really good stuff. In 1847, he began editing his own abolitionist newspaper because, as he put it, it was his goal to see in this slave-holding, slave-trading, and Negro-hating land a printing press and a paper permanently established under the complete control and direction of the immediate victims of slavery and oppression. Abolitionist organizations spread across the South. They started mailing abolitionist pamphlets to the South, to the point that Andrew Jackson told the post office not to deliver any abolitionist newspaper or pamphlet in the South. Several of the prominent abolitionist speakers were women, which was a scandal at the time. Women weren't really supposed to be doing public speaking. Two of the most famous were Sarah and Angelina Grimke, sisters. They were on the lower right or lower left of the slide. They were sisters from South Carolina who traveled the North talking about what slavery was really like. Isabella Baumfree escaped slavery in 1826 and renamed herself Sojourner Truth. That's her there, that is. I would have loved to talk to her. She was not only an advocate for abolitionism, but she was an advocate for women's rights. And so when she spoke about women's rights from the platform and men in the audience hissed, she said, direct quote, "You may hiss as much as you please, but women will get their rights anyway. You can't stop us neither." It took a while, but she was right. Okay, shifting topics again, two more things to cover. One is the American literature takes the first really amazing period of American literature is in the decades before the Civil War. The first best-selling American author was Washington Irving. His first success came back in 1809. It was called A History of New York. He pretended it was written by a Dutch historian named Diederik Knickerbocker. Knickerbocker was a slang word for the original Dutch settlers of New York along the Hudson River. That's why they're the New York Knicks. So he started off with a history of New York by this pretend Diedrich Knickerbocker, and then he started writing short stories. The sketchbook appeared in 1819, set in the Hudson River Valley, and it's best known for Rip Van Winkle, right? And the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, and poor Ichabod Crane. Another person making his mark on American letters in the 1820s, particularly, was Noah Webster. He was from New Haven, and he studied how America had changed the English language compared to what it was when it was brought over here across the Atlantic. In 1828, he published the first dictionary of American English. There it is. He lived in that house in New Haven. Now, the first truly best-selling American author was James Fenimore Cooper. From the town of Cooperstown, which was founded by his father in upstate New York. He was best known for what were called the leather stocking tales, set on the front back when upstate New York was a true frontier, including The Last of the Mohicans and The Deer Slayer. It was a great time. The leading poet of the era was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Born in Portland, Maine, but spent most of his life, nearly 50 years, living in that house on Brattle Street in Cambridge, which is a marvelous house. And then, the years from 1840 to 1860 were an even greater blossoming of American literature. And, as you probably all know, many of the leading authors had a connection to New England and particularly Concord, Massachusetts. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote poems, gave lectures, he published his essays. He may have been the first person to make a living traveling the country giving lectures. He was a very popular speaker. He also caused scandal from time to time. He gave an address to the Harvard Divinity School in 1838 in which he told the graduates of the Harvard Divinity School that Jesus was not God. That didn't go over well. But he was a leading representative of what has become known as transcendentalism, which is way too complicated for me to try to explain here. But the basic idea is that there's more to life than making money. There's something spiritual going on. The universe is more complex than just the material world we're all stuck in. And he was trying to figure out and develop a connection with whatever that spiritual something is that transcends the world that we appear to live in. And some of his stuff is still pretty fascinating. One of his neighbors was come over here. There we are. One of his neighbors was Henry David Thoreau, America's first great naturalist, but also a pioneer in the field of civil disobedience. I don't have time in a class like this to talk about the war with Mexico, but in 1848, America actually 1846, America manufactured a reason to go to war with Mexico so that we could grab Texas and the whole Southwest. And James Polk invented the war. It was a fraud, but it brought us Arizona, New Mexico, California. It brought us a lot of land. Thoreau protested the war and refused to pay his taxes because his taxes were going to contribute to paying for the war with Mexico. So they put him in jail. And the story is that Emerson goes to visit him in jail. And he's behind bars, and Emerson says to him, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" And Thoreau says to him, "Waldo, what are you doing out there?" A few years later, he built himself a little cabin on Emerson's property near Walden Pond and wrote about it. Certainly one of the most famous books in American literature. That's a replica of the cabin. It's still there next to the pond. Another landmark author is Nathaniel Hawthorne, descended from a judge in the Salem witch trials. I don't know if that man ever smiled. Certainly that it doesn't look like it to me, and if you read him, it doesn't seem like it either. He really was obsessed with the dark side of human nature and Puritan guilt. But he did live in Concord for a while. He also, for a time, had a patronage job at the Customs House in Salem, which is that beautiful federal building on the top of the slide. If you go visit that building on the harbor in Salem, they had his office set up the way it might have looked when he worked there. And a couple of his classics, of course, are The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables. Another writer with a Massachusetts connection is Herman Melville. He grew up in Pittsfield in Western Mass in that house. He first became a success. He went to sea, wrote about his adventures in the Pacific, and his Tales of the South Pacific were bestsellers in the late 1840s. He also spent some time on a whaling ship. He used that experience as a basis for Moby Dick. Nobody understood it. Moby Dick sold precisely 3,000 copies in his lifetime. Today it's considered pretty much the best novel anyone in America has ever written. But I think that's the general consensus, but not back then. Another guy in the 1840s that nobody understood too well was Edgar Allan Poe. He was actually born in Boston, but he ended up being raised down in Virginia. He received special permission from the courts so that he could marry his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia. There she is. They lived happily in that White House in Brooklyn until she died at the age of 24. And he never got over it. He later lived in Baltimore in that brick house. Wrote poetry, gothic horror stories. He invented the detective story, basically. Like Melville, nobody understood him in his lifetime. He died at the age of 40. He was found in a gutter in Baltimore, and there's still speculation about whether it was alcoholism or something else that did him in. But what a loss of talent. But I've done lots of men here, but the most successful author before the Civil War was Harriet Beecher Stowe. She married a professor of biblical literature at Bowdoin in Brunswick, Maine. They sheltered runaway slaves in their house in Brunswick. There's the house. And she decided to write a book that would illustrate the horrors of slavery. And it first came out in weekly installments, Uncle Tom's Cabin. When it was time to print it as a book, the printer really didn't know what to expect, so he only ordered 5,000 copies of the bound volume. It sold 300,000 copies. Staggering. And really helped bring a lot of Northern public opinion around to the idea that slavery was simply unacceptable and that compromising with slavery in the South was no longer acceptable. The story is that during the Civil War in 1862, she visited the White House and met Abraham Lincoln. And apparently, one of her relatives was there and reports that Lincoln, Lincoln's really tall. And he looks down at Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was really small, and he says, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war. Sit down, please." And they had a nice chat. Now, it was a good time to be an author in some respects, because there were more ways to reach your audience. And there were new magazines and newspapers that brought fiction and poetry and essays to the middle class. The Saturday Evening Post. It's the first national periodical. It was started in 1821. Harper's Monthly showed up in 1850. The lead thing that it featured was a serialization of Dickens' Bleak House, and it sold a lot of copies for that. The Atlantic Monthly, which published Emerson and Hawthorne and Longfellow. You had new technology making it easier to print cheap newspapers. The New York Sun was the first penny paper in the country. Horace Greeley there was the editor of the New York Tribune, which became kind of the New York Times of its day, the most sophisticated newspaper. But the Times itself showed up in 1851, as did the Boston Herald in 1846. Yeah, it goes back. It's older than the Chicago Tribune or the New York Times. All right, I want to close, and I have... Oh, all right, not too bad. So I want to close with one more topic, which is, and it is the status of women in America before the Civil War. Women in mid 19th century America suffered from their own form of slavery. To some extent, it was just the traditional hard work of being a farm wife. Remember, 2/3 of the population are still living on farms, and women on farms had this traditional jobs of, raising vegetables and farm animals, making the meals, making all the clothing, and of course, raising children. That is hard work. They kept having babies. Yes, they did. That is so I hear. I don't know personally, but to some extent, the older children helped raise the younger children on a farm. But the men are off doing their thing in the fields and hunting, and the women are taking care of everything within the borders of the farm itself. But in the years before the Civil War, about 10% of women worked outside the home and got paid for it. Most of them were textile workers. There's some engravings of and photos of mill girls before the Civil War. 70-hour work week. It's 100 degrees in the mills because they have to keep the cotton humid and moist. The windows are closed, and you've got cotton fiber everywhere. They're inhaling cotton fiber all the time. The illness, white lung disease. It was a very tough way to live and to make a living. Other women were servants, the women who got paid in cash. Servants, laundresses, like the ladies in the upper right there. Seamstresses. There were a lot of women in the making clothing. But for middle-class women, a different sort of prison was developing, and what historians like to call the cult of domesticity, which is a fancy way of saying that this is the concept that there are separate spheres. Men and women are inherently different. Men are suited to the rough and tumble of business and politics. We're aggressive, we're pushy, we don't have feelings, or we don't let them get in the way. Women, it's a strange double whammy. Women are emotional and weak on one level, but they have special spiritual and moral faculties that make them ideally suited to raise children and to create a wonderful oasis for the husbands to come home to. Right? Sound familiar? We've got some engravings. There's a mother reading to a child. You've got lots of those ladies are looking rather domestic. There was a whole magazine, Godey's Lady Book, devoted to portraying, articles about how to be the right kind of perfect mother and wife. I don't know what to make of that photo. So it's one of the best photos I could find of middle-class women before the Civil War. They really look angry. To me. On the other hand, you have to remember that, you had to sit still for minutes while your photo developed. So it wasn't like they could move around or smile. The culture and the society and the legal system were stacked against women. As soon as a woman got married, she lost her legal identity. Her husband immediately took control of all of her property. Husbands could beat their wives. Husbands could lock up their wives. Women had virtually no legal right to get a divorce, even if they were getting beaten up on a regular basis. In Illinois, a husband could have his wife committed to a mental institution without a public hearing and certainly without her consent. And of course, women couldn't vote. some women in the 1840s, 1850s start questioning the rules. One of the most famous, amazing figure is Margaret Fuller. She lived in that house on Cherry Street in Cambridgeport. For a time, she edited The Dial, which was the Transcendentalist monthly magazine. In 1845, she wrote a book called Women in the 19th Century, which you can still get on Amazon. It's a very interesting read in which she's talking about all the various ways that women need equality and don't have it. Horace Greeley, who edited the New York Tribune, hired Margaret Fuller as a reporter. So he sent her to Italy, and she went to report on the Italian Revolution of 1848. Sadly, on the way back, the ship wrecked off the coast of Fire Island. She, her husband, and their son died. They never found her body, but there is a memorial to her in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. Now, while Fuller was covering the Italian Revolution of 1848, a different sort of revolution was getting started in upstate New York. And there are the culprits. On the upper left there, you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was very well educated by the standards of the day. She married a well-known abolitionist. When they put together their marriage vows, she omitted the word obey. She direct quote, "I obstinately refused to obey one with whom I supposed I was entering into an equal relation." Makes sense? She didn't take his last name. She just added it to her own name. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton. For a while, she lived in Boston, where she knew Emerson and was hooked up with the Transcendentalist Circle. And then her husband moved them to Seneca Falls, New York, which is way the heck out there, between Syracuse and Rochester. She felt trapped. She hated it. She just hated it. And one day in 1848, Lucretia Mott, the lady on the right, a Quaker abolitionist, happened to be passing through Seneca Falls. They have a chat. That's Stanton's house where they met. And they decided to hold a public meeting to discuss the status of women in America. So they published that notice in the paper. They were extremely surprised when 200 women and 40 men arrived for the conference. They met in that little Wesleyan chapel in Seneca Falls. Many of the women were workers at the local glove factory. And the convention adopted a declaration of sentiments which said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." They demanded legal and social equality. They demanded the right to vote. Some of the men were shocked and, well, let's put it this way. Stanton's husband left town. He skipped out. He didn't think it was a smart time to be there while the convention. And Stanton's father showed up and had her examined for insanity. He threatened to disinherit her. He didn't. After things started to change a little bit on the eve of the Civil War, the next big reform for women was when states gave them legal equality in the sense of being able to own their own property, make their own contracts, and not just have everything handed over to the husband as soon as they got married. And that was a reform that came along in the northern states in the 1850s and 1860s. But women's suffrage takes another 70 years. We'll get to that in a couple lectures from now. But unfortunately, that took quite a while. All right, so that's it for today. I have no idea what time it is, but thank you for listening. We'll be here next Tuesday at 1:30 to talk about the Gilded Age, America after the Civil War. And I hope this worked. And I guess, Rob, if we could put the lights on so people don't fall over each other, that would be great. Thank you all.